questions throughout the session, please feel free to drop those in the chat. We'll have a pre-submitted Q&A session or section of the presentation, and then we'll also move into a live Q&A where we can field all your questions, and then we'll collect questions in case we're unable to answer them during our session. So it looks like the meeting is being recorded now, so we will get started. Thanks again for being here. We're with Forth. We have a lot of our great partners on the Charge at Home project here. Again, Charge at Home is a project that's focused on education and resource sharing for the multifamily housing industry related to EV charging. And this is just an EV 101 session with my colleague, Whit Jamison. So again, we provide free electric vehicle charging guidance, tools, and support to multifamily decision makers. All of these sessions are recorded and are stored on our website at www.chargeathome.org/events. We have our next session up there, which is scheduled for end of March, and we invite you to join us. Without anythings, we can get started. So let me introduce my great colleague, Whit Jamison. So Whit is a senior specialist at Forth on the Access to Charging team. He has a background in energy science, studying electric vehicles, utility, power generation, and the grid through his Bachelor in Science in Energy Science at Western Washington University. While at Forth, Whit has worked on many programs, including Forth's eFarms program, utility and ride and drive focused programs, EV charging at multifamily properties, workplaces, along corridors, and in the right-of-way. In his spare time, Whit loves listening to audiobooks and podcasts, especially those about urban design and housing. So thank you all for being here today, and we will get started. Whit, take it away.
Thank you. All right. So this is sort of the outline of what we'll be discussing today. So sort of level setting with the case for EV charging at multifamily properties. EV ownership is on the rise, and obviously people that drive electric vehicles want to charge where they park. More and more people will be making decisions about where they live, especially renters, based on access to charging. And this is already being seen in high adoption areas. Next slide. So considerable number of people in the US live in apartments. And there's quite a few more that live in condos as well. So it's a sizable portion of the United States, and a considerable number of those people have at least one vehicle per household. There was a study done a couple of years ago by National Multifamily Housing Council, which is a partner on this project, and one of their survey partners, that found that most EV drivers at apartments prefer charging convenience and affordability over charging speed. And that's an important factor that we'll come back to later on in the conversation. We're going to skip a little bit ahead past the sort of EV 101 super basics around what is and isn't an electric vehicle. But simply put, that section is battery electric vehicles that are only powered from their battery, plug-in hybrids and plug-in hybrids that are hybrid vehicles that have large enough batteries to support driving just on electric range just by themselves for some amount of miles, and then they turn into just hybrids. And both have their use cases. So hopping over into the charging basics. For level 1 charging, typically you're talking about an outlet and then using a portable electric vehicle supply equipment charger that you plug into the wall, and then you can unplug it anytime you want to. For standard level 1 charging at most places, we're talking about an outlet that is not your typical indoor wall outlet, but is actually a dedicated 120 volt outlet. This is because National Electrical Code requires dedicated circuitry for electric vehicle charging purposes. And of course, you can plug in a level 1 charger to any wall outlet. Just you might trip the breaker if it's not set up, or if your car doesn't recognize that it's using a circuit that has multiple outlets on it. So level 2 charging is considerably faster, although ranges considerably from around 2 kilowatts all the way up to 20 kilowatts, with the average being around typically between 6 kilowatts and 10 kilowatts. And for reference, like a microwave oven is usually about 1,000 watts or 1 kilowatt. So similar to that level of power, but constant for fairly long time periods at times. And some vehicles actually only can accept certain levels of power based on the hardware components that the auto manufacturers install them with. Both level 1 and level 2 chargers utilize either so apologies for the details here, but the J1772 plug, you don't need to know what that is. That's just the standard plug. And then there's this other plug called the Tesla or the National or North American Charging Standard plug, which all Teslas use. And in the coming months, there will be a new standard that will retroactively work for all Teslas, but will look like the Tesla plug. There's some differences in some of the protocols, the communication protocols, and some of the back-end hardware. But that sort of will become the North American standard long-term. All auto manufacturers that produce vehicles have already agreed to adopt that standard as soon as it is out. Again, we're expecting that to be finalized in the coming months, and then having manufacturers producing that plug and all the associated hardware behind that plug by mid to end of the year, although there's obviously going to be manufacturing quality assurance checks to ensure that the quality of the products are available. All right. Level 2 chargers can be either, typically they're hardwired to the circuitry and to the panel that supports the circuit. However, you can also install an outlet and then just plug in a portable charger, which is what I do typically. And level 2 chargers are widely effective for a lot of different places, whether it's home, public, or workplaces, and honestly, even in some fleet applications as well. So this is sort of a charging overview. We're not going to talk at all about DC fast charging at this point. If anybody has questions about it, we can go over that in Q&A section. But for now, DC fast charging doesn't typically have a role to play in multifamily properties. And there are exceptions to that rule, but there's not many. This also gives sort of a high overview of the costs. Again, DC fast charging is considerably more expensive. Level 1 charging is basically setting up an outlet, and level 2 charging is can be far more complex depending on the number of chargers, the length of the installation, the length of the conduit run, trenching, and a lot of other things involved there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. All right. So level 2 chargers are typically, when they're in the public, are typically networked, which just means connected to the internet. And they typically are connected to the internet in a few different ways, but the most common is cellularly connected, if that's a word. Occasionally you'll have Wi-Fi connection or even a hardwired line. The point of networking chargers is to provide features. The main features that property managers and owners typically want are access controls, revenue generation, management portal, remote monitoring, and honestly, there's other ones as well. And the features that residents and frankly, just any EV driver wants is remote monitor or is notification systems, reservation systems in some cases. Knowing whether the charger is in use or not can be really, really helpful, especially if you're coming in from a long distance. For multifamily folks, it's like just knowing that it's there and being able to find out ahead of time and sometimes reserve is really helpful for people that don't have there's only a few chargers for a lot of different EV drivers at an individual property. That can be really, really critical. And then I added in demand and response at the bottom because for utilities that are providing incentives, they typically want those chargers to be able to respond to utility signals. So that's important. And the load management, we'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. But load management features are incredibly important for installations that are that have some sort of constraint on the electrical capacity at the property. So load management features can be incredibly important for enabling greater access to charging at multifamily properties. So I want to talk a little bit more about EV readiness as it is a topic that is widely discussed and not always well understood. So what is it? Simply put, it's electrical infrastructure that supports quicker and lower cost installation of ports in the future. It's specifically panel capacity that you can add chargers to or circuits to in the future. It's running conduit to parking spaces, again, for future purposes, for future use. And there's quite a few other aspects of what EV readiness is, and we'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. But why it matters, EV readiness and EV ready parking spaces dramatically reduce the cost of installation in the future. And it's just part of you can plan more during construction. You already have a lot of trenching going on, and adding in those costs is really important. All right, next slide. All right, so again, this slide sort of simplified down. There's sort of 3 levels of EV readiness. I'll start with the most simple, EVSE installed, which is simply just either an outlet that is ready to be used or an actual EV charger with a port, like a plug installed and ready to charge. Next up is EV ready, which is everything's in the ground, wiring, breaker, all the way to an outlet, or in some cases, to a junction box. It depends on who you ask on that, but typically the install time for an EV charger or the final setup for from EV ready to ready to go is usually within an hour. In some cases, it can be longer, but that's typically the amount of time it takes for an electrician that knows what they're doing to install a charger or a charge port at a multifamily property with an EV ready parking space. Oh, Anna, can you go back? And then lastly, EV capable is a circuit that has conduit run and panel capacity, but does not have the wiring or like an outlet at the end, and definitely does not have a charger at the end of it. All right, next slide. So in multifamily properties, there's 2 different types of charging you'll see. The first one and more common is first come, first serve chargers. And these are able to be used by any residents that have access, actually anyone that has access to that lot. So in some cases, even that lot can be open to the public, but typically we're talking chargers that are meant for residents and sometimes visitors. And these chargers are typically installed in extra parking spaces first. And then as demand grows, that sometimes can become an issue, actually. If you have too many people trying to use communal chargers, that is actually an issue you run into pretty regularly as EV adoption rises, because these chargers can only serve so many vehicles at a time. Often you'll see first come, first serve chargers have 2 ports. And one of the strategies for reducing cost of installation and still providing as much access to charging as possible is to provide power sharing chargers, where you have one circuit providing power to the charger. And then if one car is plugged in, they may be able to access a higher speed of charger while there's just one car plugged in. If 2 cars are plugged in, they split the power usually evenly. All right, next slide. All right, dedicated chargers are the other type of plug. These chargers are meant to be used only by anybody that has access to that parking space. So in multifamily properties, you either have assigned or unassigned parking spaces. Occasionally you'll have parking lots that have a mixture of both. And the larger the site, the more common that is. Or if you live in a place that has, say, hail or snow, oftentimes some parking spaces will have overhang or a covering, or even garage spots. And those spots will be assigned, and the residents will pay more for those. And then same sort of goes with charging often. These spots can be assigned, and in condominium situations, typically they're deeded. So dedicated chargers work really only in assigned parking spaces. And long-term in places where all the parking spaces are taken up and there's no extra parking space to put a first come, first served communal charger, you're gonna see dedicated chargers typically work better long-term. They also can be a more cost-effective route for property owners and property managers, as there's usually a price premium to parking spaces that have chargers, dedicated chargers. Yeah, next slide. All right. So this gets more into some of the considerations around new builds and why sometimes people run into issues, why property owners and managers run into issues around EV charging. So for some developers that are build to sell developers, lack of knowledge about EV charging and EV readiness value proposition, just they cannot recognize the value because their business model is derived off of immediate return on investment after they sell, as soon as the property has leased up. That said, more and more property owners are recognizing the value of EV readiness because they know that it takes a long time to perform retrofits and they're more expensive. So this is quickly becoming more common that you run into property owners that understand the value and recognize it and are willing to pay more for it. And again, it's so much cheaper to install conduits, do trenching, and install panels and meters, et cetera, during new construction than it is on retrofits, that there is a value to EV readiness, and more developers are recognizing it. And it's not to say that it's not going to be expensive at times. We've heard estimates between $1,500 and $3,000 per EV ready parking space. And obviously it's going to depend on the specifics of the property, but that is, it's a cost, and developers are really, they understand their costs. So one of the major items I really am excited to see at new builds is the appropriate application of load management systems, especially in dedicated parking spaces, because if you utilize load management systems from the get-go, you're able to you're able to plan ahead for when all parking spaces are being utilized by EVs, whether that's 2030 or 2040 or even 2045, 2050, and maybe even beyond that in some places. These sort of load management systems, and we'll go into that in just a second, actually, are critical for enabling lower cost installations while providing access to charging to as many people, as many residents as possible. Another consideration around new builds that is frustrating for developers and the multifamily industry overall is codes varying significantly across jurisdictions. And additionally, EV knowledgeable contractors, there are more and more now, and honestly, most contractors are very familiar with charging, and again, EV readiness is just, you know, what electricians do all the time. So it's not like this is a new factor in that case. Going back to the load management systems, there's sort of three types of load management systems. One is integrated within networked chargers. One is sort of a load management system within a panel or using a smart panel. Sometimes there's a sort of a brain, that's a weird way of saying it, but a brain box, a computer that controls the load across a panel. In other cases, you have you actually have the whole building or property being monitored in different ways. And that also can factor into load management systems at a higher level. And that can be integrated into EV charging load management systems as well. And of course, I threw cost in there because at the end of the day, for new build considerations, developers are always looking at cost. Apologies there. The cost of everything is something that developers are looking at, and lowering that cost is critical to making sure that EV charging is there. EV readiness is built into new properties, and developers are able to see this as an advantageous piece of infrastructure to install at their properties, as well as sorry, should make that simpler. Perfect. And then of course, I don't want to forget about the Charge at Home project. Of course, education for multifamily decision makers. This is the whole point of why we're doing this project. We want to put all the educational resources that we can into this website, the chargeathome.org website, and let people, or make sure people can learn from lessons in the past and other multifamily experts. So this is why we're doing this kind of project. And all right, next slide. All right. So existing properties, obviously you've basically got two different types of properties, new builds and then existing properties. In some cases, you have existing properties that are adding new buildings. Typically, those are going to be looked at as if they are new construction, because they basically are. So existing properties, a lot of the barriers are around cost, but those costs can be anything from, you don't have electrical capacity, you need a new panel. You don't have service capacity to, add a new panel. Therefore, you're going to have to go to the utility, get a load study, and that takes time and money. So frankly, all of these factors at some point become an issue around money. Some of them are an issue around time and money. Some people would argue that time is just an extension of money, but in some cases it can remove the project from being feasible. So some of the other issues and barriers around existing properties are parking is often constrained. We have a lot of properties that just do not have any parking available. So where are you going to install chargers? Or are you going to, try to take a dedicated approach And that works, that can work really well. But it also, requires a shift for property owners and managers. And the ROI is really key. Like if the property owner and manager aren't comfortable with the risks associated with installing these chargers and say raising rents, they're worried about turnover. And that can impact the decisions around installing chargers, and it does. So parking constraints are actually pretty serious when it comes to EV charger installations, especially when sometimes if you install one charger, that charger has to be ADA accessible, and that means you may need to restripe your entire parking lot or a section of your parking lot. That can be a fairly big burden. All right, so I think I already mentioned utility service upgrades right there. And then getting to the sort of the solutions. Mainly the solutions are load management and then utilizing lower power options. Sometimes it's a cost issue and trying to find lower cost options, including power sharing chargers. Smart outlets can be a great route for lowering costs. Really excited to see the future of smart outlets in multifamily properties, especially. And just making sure to stakeholders have more knowledge around their options here. So again, comes back to the Charge at Home project and what we're trying to do and provide information for property owners, managers, developers, and frankly, a lot of the stakeholders in this area, whether it's electricians or electrical engineers, other contractors as well, utilities, regulators, and even more. So that's about it for our existing property considerations. We'll move on to questions, I think, next.
Yeah, thank you so much, Whit. Great. So we're moving into some pre-submitted Q&A, and we invite folks as questions come up, either responses to the pre-submitted Q&A or just questions you have in general or in response to Whit's presentation. Please drop in the chat. We'll get to those in a second. We did have a few really great questions come in yesterday from some of our registrants who joined us yesterday. So we'll be reading those as well, but we did not have a chance to triage those before. So just a heads up. Okay, let's get to the first question we have. So the question is, how can we strengthen right to charge laws?
Sorry about that. Just take a sip of water. So this question, right to charge laws, first of all, should try to define them. Typically enable condominium owners, and in some cases, apartment residents to install chargers sort of by right. And in some cases, that means that if there's available capacity, the condominium owner can install chargers, even if the their HOA doesn't want them to. In other cases, it makes the property, it basically forces the property to install chargers if there's no electrical access. And one of the issues with Charge at Home or right to charge laws is that they vary by state, and they vary widely by state. So you can find out more at this awesome website, Plug in America, friend of Fourth. Their right to charge policies, their right to charge policy page is really solid. And in some cases, if your state does not already have right to charge laws, the best way to move forward with that is to contact your legislators and either educate them about the importance or advocate for specific things if you're looking for that. I've met with some people that have actually worked back in the mid-teens to get right to charge laws put in place in their state. There's a lot of nuance here, and it's best to check out your own state's laws before, advocating for something that might already be on the books. And there's a lot of nuance here as well. Oh, and actually, I do want to mention right to charge policies sort of in the past, or at least in the last couple of years, I think the industry, the EV charging industry has started to recognize that there's some limitations to right to charge laws. And especially when the first few, basically the existing panel capacity was used up by the early adopters, and may have prevented, frankly, longer term solutions from being allowed. And so a lot of multifamily properties are running into, and specifically condos are running into just capacity issues where they may have been able to provide 16 or 20 level 1 outlets at some point, but because the capacity is used up by 3 or 4 level 2 chargers that are dedicated to specific unit owners, it's harder to move forward with a redesign when you're removing somebody else's property. So there's a lot of HOA conflicts that have happened around EV charging over the last few years. I'm optimistic, especially with the load management tools and features that we have in the last few years, really coming out to be a consistent way to deal with these sort of problems, especially in condos.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah,
Whit.
thanks. If I can add
Absolutely.
there, thanks for adding that bit. I think it's a really important discussion about the challenges with power allocation. And so I think looking at the how can we strengthen part of the right to charge laws, they're great. They say that a condo can't, stop you from installing charging, but they don't specify, what is a fair way to share limited power capacity. And so, one way to strengthen, and I don't know if we have great examples for some of those early laws, is starting with the idea that everyone should have the ability to charge, and that properties should look at ways to fairly allocate that capacity as well as costs between the residents. But the load management systems, as we've talked about, are really good because not everyone needs a dedicated 40 amp circuit, which can charge 250 miles plus a day. But if you can divide up all the available capacity, and some people charge more, some people charge less, but you can charge a lot of cars with a relatively limited amount of capacity. And then the other part of strengthening right to charge laws is, they don't normally talk about costs, and the cost becomes a big barrier, which again is why load management, making the most of existing capacity, makes sense. But the other part of strengthening, policy efforts is there utility incentives? Is there other local government or state incentives that can help fund the cost of energy upgrades or load management systems and the purchase of the hardware and things like that? Because the cost is really the barrier to installing charging, even if you have the right to install it.
And when I mentioned, that's Kevin Wood. He's been on this project for the whole term and an entire previous project. And thank you for that addition, because those are really important parts of this conversation. It's been a long-term conversation in the EV industry. Yeah.
Awesome. Yes, thanks, Kevin. Kevin is with Energetics, if you can see in his background. So yeah, we have a lot of really great partners on Charge at Home. So these are the folks you have access to by attending these roundtables. So that was a great question. Let's move on to the next question. What's the best time of year to install and why?
And Brandon, feel free to come off mute and camera if you want to. And I can obviously start off with the stuff we've written down, but Brandon, do you have anything you wanted to add to the answers here?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks, Whit. And Just real quick, I'm Brandon Oldham on this project, Charge at Home from CalStart, Senior Project Manager of EV Charging Solutions. And this one, it could be nuanced across the nation. Weather's going to be your biggest driver. So some states year round is okay, but I think there's some details that are important to consider related to supply chain and also the time of the year. Some states and general incentives come tax season have end of the year deadlines. And so if you're rushing work by the end of the year, just know you can be hitting a barrier of getting those deadlines to be qualified for certain incentives or tax opportunities. Spring and summer are going to be your best. Favorable weather. Most of these projects depend on the size. If you're going to be trenching or laying conduit, you want ideal weather. Also, you have longer daytime, so you have more hours in the day to work. Fall will be your second best, but then as you get into fall, you're running up to the end of the year incentive deadlines, and then also be mindful that sometimes there's some supply constraints and labor constraints. If everyone's rushing to get these types of projects built, there's ultimately going to be a constraint on the labor workforce regionally. So that can either drive up costs or just impact the availability and scheduling of those projects. Winter is your least ideal. This can depend on which climate you're in. California some not necessarily, but you still don't want to be dealing with rain. Sites that'll be wet, trenching. But again, I think those are some key things you want to look out for is weather-wise, spring and summer, fall is your second best. Be mindful that you may not be the only one trying to do these projects. So if everyone's rushing at the end of the year or during the summer, you can constrain the labor supply.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. And that encompasses our answer for the most part. So thank you so much. Appreciate your insight. And Brandon will be joining us as a presenter on one of these roundtables in the future. So look forward to his subject matter expertise. Our next question is, are there basic non-network solutions that can keep per kilowatt hour costs low for tenants?
So for anybody that's not familiar with kilowatts or kilowatt hours are basically energy. Most electric vehicles, all electric vehicles right now have typically between 40 and 120 kilowatt hours of battery life. And most vehicles can get about 2 to 5 miles per kilowatt hour. That's sort of the unit of measure, similar to miles per gallon, just a different unit. Don't have to worry about that too often, but it's good to know. Obviously, if you've got a 60 kilowatt hour battery pack vehicle and you're down to 10%, you got 6 kilowatt hours left. You're going to want to charge it, a good chunk overnight. The way that most chargers facilitate that transaction is a cost, usually in cents per kilowatt hour. Typical rate around here is about 16 to 20 cents per kilowatt hour. All costs factored in. So what the charger owner or service provider is going to do is mark up that cost, and that's sort of where all of their profit is built in, all of their ROI, and so that's what this question is asking about when they're asking about keeping per kilowatt hour costs low for tenants. There's not really any way. Non-network chargers don't typically enable revenue generation through the charger itself. Typically just because they don't have features. So typically for property management, you're going to have a flat rate that they require residents to pay if you have access to a charger that's not networked, and they'll just make it high enough so that they're pretty sure they're not going to lose money and get the rate of return that they're looking for. Sometimes they'll make it free and just increase rent or a parking fee, and then some will sub-meter chargers and then add that cost specifically onto rent payment. That typically is more seen in dedicated charging situations. And so I want to move on to the next point, which is really around keeping per kilowatt hour costs low isn't actually the same thing as keeping overall car charging expenses low. And frankly, from a cost benefit analysis standpoint for property owners and managers, parking fees actually can be more lucrative than markups on a per kilowatt hour basis. And what I've seen is one of the more fair ways of going about it is setting the cost per kilowatt hour on a networked charger to a few cents higher than the cost of electricity that your property pays, and making sure that that cost is actually changing as the costs, your utility bills change. And then adding on some sort of cost to all users, all residents that use the chargers consistently, dividing up those fixed costs, whether it's ongoing costs from networked chargers, or just to make sure that your chargers are performing or providing you an ROI that covers your own costs. That sort of divides up the ongoing costs as well as the energy costs as fairly as possible. And if you have any questions about that strategy, let me know. Additionally, there's not really any way to mitigate rent increases from added amenities in general, EV chargers especially, unless the amenity is ubiquitous in the multifamily industry. We've seen this with, frankly, a lot of different amenities, but I think one of the ones that's most stark to people is hot water heaters. Hot water heaters were not always ubiquitous, and now they very much are. I do expect EV charging to go that way, although it will take a very long time as building lives. It's theoretically easier to add a hot water heater than it is to add a EV charger at this point. But I do see that being the long-term route for EV charging. It'll just get built in and it'll become standard. And then that marginal benefit sort of becomes standard. Or you could theoretically, as a regulator or a incentive provider, add strings attached to an incentive program. And there's pros and cons I've listed here to non-network chargers. A lot of asterisks, apologies for that, but there's a lot of nuance in networked and non-networked solutions. And again, if you have any questions, let us know.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, but I want to address some of these questions that came in with registration. If you have any other questions, drop them in the chat. But the first one we have here is, I'm interested in easy ways to connect dedicated spots to resident meters, as well as the potential for sub-metering.
Okay. Can you put it in the chat as well for anybody that wants it?
Varun, do you mind dropping on the chat, please? Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. And do you want to move the slide to the next one? Okay. That was a long question.
Yeah, so I'll read it again.
Apologies. Thank you.
I'm interested in easy ways to connect dedicated spots to resident meters, as well as the potential for sub-metering.
Perfect. Yeah, so what's being asked about is connecting EV charging to the resident meters, typically known as direct to wire or wiring direct to meter, and enabling residents to access utility rates. And that is actually one of the best ways to enable low cost charging access to residents at multifamily properties, and is typically most seen in condominiums, although this is a very new area of the industry. We actually have, I think, somebody on the call here that represents a company that can offer a product solution for this solution specifically. So if y'all are interested in that, definitely shout out in the chat, because I'm sure they would love to connect with you. This is actually an area that I'm most interested in seeing property owners and managers move towards. One, because it's best for residents, and two, it also simplifies their lives in some cases. There's quite a few different companies that already work in the sub-metering realm for multifamily properties. Again, sub-metering is something that happens regularly at a lot of properties. So companies already are familiar with doing this. This is just a new load that they would be monitoring, and then sort of providing integration into the billing software, and sort of takes the costs out of a third party at times and puts it into the property owners and managers. Obviously, the property owners and managers can increase those costs significantly as well, but that sort of doesn't go away because they could always increase based on the market rate and what the property, or sorry, what the company wants to do, sort of to increase rents and make an ROI on the amenity that they've added.
Yeah, if I can just add one piece of nuance, it's another one of those check your state, and I don't think there's a great resource, but different states have different rules around sub-meterings, and if a building is able to bill by the kilowatt hour through a sub-meter for electricity, or definitely a Public Utilities Commission has to approve a program if there's a program that lets a sub-meter, add to your main electricity bill if it's not wired directly. Definitely having chargers in a dedicated spot that wire directly to a unit's panel is the simplest and straightforward and cuts out any other middleman. But unfortunately, most buildings were not designed to do that. Yeah, I see. So made a comment of one of the sub-metering solutions are definitely out there and worth looking. And to the other question about low cost non-network units, as I think I would just restate what Whit said. You have to look at all of the costs, but certainly when comparing network providers, thinking about what the total cost to the property is going to be, and you don't want to have to spend $100 a month on metering systems to count $20 a month worth of electricity. So just thinking about what the total cost of the property is, I think, is an important thing. But you generally want to have some way of being able to track and recover the electricity costs, and just finding a provider that can do it for a lowest cost that meets your needs is an important step.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin. Yeah, so we have one more question, or two more questions that came in. So the next one is, what are some vehicle to grid integration solutions available for multifamily housing? And Varun will drop that in the chat as well.
So vehicle to grid solutions, and I guess I haven't mentioned anything about this tech in this presentation. Vehicle to grid is a complex field that's still fairly new, but through an inverter, you're able to take power from your vehicle and either use it in your house or even export it to the grid. It has to go through. You have to have hardware that's approved at a certain level, and for that final connection to the grid, you would need a interconnection agreement and sort of a transaction agreement with the utility. But even if you don't want to deal with that, you still could utilize vehicle to home or vehicle to load technologies, where your home is being powered by your car, or maybe some of the power that your home is using is coming from your vehicle, or for vehicle to load, it could just be you plug in electrical, like a lawnmower or something like that, into your car, and you run your lawnmower, a corded electric lawnmower, off of your car. And that's completely doable today. A ton of vehicles offer that. It's a little bit trickier when it comes to full vehicle to grid integration. And there's a lot of nuance when it comes to the chargers that actually facilitate the flow of power from the vehicle to the grid, or vehicle to the home. There's additional hardware that you have to install, and currently it's fairly expensive to install that full set of equipment. So it's sort of out of reach, even for most single family homes. For multifamily, it's even trickier because you have basically the integration of the utility contracts makes it even trickier. And so you sort of need some sort of third party, whether it's the property owner or a third party outside of property and multifamily industry realm to aggregate a lot of different connections, even on one site, and then facilitate that transaction with the utility when there's a request for power flow, or to just export power anytime that there's extra battery capacity and people want to export power. It's fairly interesting, and it's an area that I'm really excited to see as sort of the smart grid and the resiliency movement in grid structure and grid infrastructure moves along. But in multifamily properties, it's particularly tricky at this point, given some of the financial constraints. Technologically, we have the capability of doing this with most vehicles that have it enabled at the auto manufacturer level, but we're still farther away than I'd like to be on V2G for your average multifamily property, let alone the residents actually making the decision making or the transaction, the agreement with the utility directly. So I'm excited to see that evolve in the coming years.
Awesome. Thank you, Whit. And before we do the last question, I know we're getting close to the end. I just wanted to say, if you want to reach out to us, there's a contact form on our website, but I've also dropped mine and Whit's direct email addresses as well. Feel free to reach out about these sessions, or just if you want any support with your project or have questions. Thank you, Stuart. And then our final question is very similar to the question I asked before this one. So we maybe went over it again, but I want to read it off again in case there's nuance. Connecting dedicated multifamily housing spots with resident meters and sub-metering smart chargers. So pretty similar.
Yeah, then maybe I don't. Yeah, I guess I could ask. I could follow up with there's other ways of connecting or enabling residents to pay for their electricity use for charging than just direct wiring chargers to meters. Usually that's not feasible due to the distance between where the car is parked and where the meter is. However, there are other ways to make that happen, typically through a third party charger that then uses an API integration with the utility for billing purposes. And that is actually a technology I'm really excited to see in the coming years. There's a couple of utilities down in California that are working directly on that technology and sort of integrating smart chargers into the billing mechanisms for utilities and enabling residents to have lower cost access to home charging, which is a major goal of the industry at this point.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Whit. I really appreciate your time today. And everyone who came off mute to offer more context, Kevin, Brandon, thank you so much to our great partners. I want to quickly just plug before we end for the day that chargeathome.org is a free program that has around 10 awesome partners working together every day to provide resources to the multifamily industry. So what we offer are market segmented EV installation toolkits that go into some of the nuances of EV charging at existing and new builds for multifamily properties for affordable housing and market rate. And we'll soon be rolling out information specific to condominiums and then potentially student housing as well. We have an EV charging project builder tool, which we've developed with Atlas Public Policy. That's awesome. That can create very specific estimates, right? Estimates for sure for your property. So you can put in, I think there's there's over 10 fields to uniquely identify your property that will generate a report for you. And you can kind of mess around with the outputs page to, mess with kilowatt hour, and then add incentives that you're aware of. And there's an incentive finder tool plugged into it. So it's really great. We encourage you to check it out on our website, chargeathome.org/tools. We have educational one-pagers. We have multifamily EV charging case studies from a previous iteration of this project. That library will be built out. We've been working with Energetics to develop a case study intake form, and we have a lot of great partners lined up to start generating those case studies. So we're really excited. That'll be on our resources page, chargeathome/resources, and the case study dropdown. We have a great glossary of terms where a ton of these terms that Whit was spewing out they're on our website. You can learn more about it, and they're linked to external resources. So we encourage you to check out our glossary. And then we have communication templates for folks like property managers to communicate with residents. Once you do implement EV charging, there's also great survey templates to survey residents if you're thinking about EV charging. And there's also resources for residents as well to advocate for EV charging for themselves. So that's, high level of this project. These roundtables are once a month for now, and they're always going to be on a Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And we hope to go into more nuanced topics down the road. We just really wanted to offer this general session to have recorded on our website. So thank you all again. Really appreciate you. Stuart just dropped the registration link for our next session. We hope to see you there. And if there's a topic you want us to cover, email us or send us something in the contact form. So, thank you all. Have a beautiful rest of your day. And yeah, thank you.